I'm Dr. Brad Hafford, archaeologist and economic anthropologist. Welcome to Note Nook, where I take a close look at a banknote from relatively recent history. As an anthropologist, I'm more interested in what money means than what it's worth. Physical money does more than simply facilitate exchange. It also carries messages over long distances, messages that say something about the authority that issued it and the people who used it. Some of these messages are rather blatant, but others are more deeply embedded or are clouded over by time. It's these messages, blatant and cloudy, that I'm going to point out in a particular example in each short episode. I've researched the meanings as much as I can, but there are still some that I'm interpreting from historical knowledge or intuiting from a general feeling. Nevertheless, the exploration of symbols, imagery, and text on the notes should lead us to some interesting thoughts. Today, we look at a 5-mark banknote issued in Imperial Germany in 1904. We begin by looking at the obverse. All notes have an obverse and reverse, or front and back, if you will. Sometimes it's hard to know which was intended as the obverse, but typically it bears the clearest symbols of the authority that issued it, often depicting the ruler or a famous historical person from the country. This is why, on coins at least, the obverse is often called heads. Along with the imagery and symbols, the obverse of a banknote will usually also include signatures of financial representatives. Text on the obverse typically focuses on the legal authority to issue the note, perhaps the bank that backed it and/or the laws that authorized it. In this case, the text states that it is an imperial banknote, Reichskassenschein. Kassenschein translates more literally to receipt. That was authorized by a law, Gesetz, passed on the 30th of April, 1874. Its value is 5 marks, and it was issued in Berlin on the 31st of October, 1904 by the Reichsschuldenverwaltung, which is the Imperial Finance Ministry or Treasury. Schuldenverwaltung translates more literally as debt management. In 1904, Germany was an empire ruled by Kaiser Wilhelm II of the Hohenzollern family, grandson of Britain's Queen Victoria. But we don't see him on this note. Instead, we have an allegorical image. It's a finely engraved image of a crowned woman bearing a lance over her left shoulder and a shield at her right hand. She represents the German Empire and its strength. The lance is not in an aggressive stance, but it implies the ability to defend, as does the shield. And the shield bears the Reichsadler, or imperial eagle. This emblem, like the title Kaiser, was derived from Roman times and was used by the Holy Roman emperors possibly as far back as Charlemagne, around the year 800. Even the woman's cloak and implied banded armor speaks of defensive strength. Yet very near her sits a child, with no armor or even clothing, holding a bird with an olive branch in its beak. This imagery of innocence and vulnerability is that of peace, protected by the strength of the empire. Cherubs, or putti, were commonly used to depict emotions such as happiness, and the bird, probably a dove, though I've heard people call it a pigeon, likely refers to Genesis 8, where Noah is said to have released a dove that came back with an olive twig in its beak. Both the olive branch and the dove are very often used to represent peace. But there's much more to this elaborate image. In the background, we see a ship, probably a cog, which is a transport merchant vessel looking rather Viking, in this case particularly with this dragon-headed prow. It's a reference to the importance of trade, especially along the Baltic Sea linked with Scandinavia, which had been vital to German interests since the Middle Ages. The cities of northern Germany had formed the Hanseatic League, an important union of mercantile cities, in the late 1100s. Near the ship is another kind of cog, a gear wheel representing industry. This was a modern age of increasing technology, and Germany had long been at the forefront of craftsmanship, also represented by the hammer and anvil nearby. And between the hammer and the cog, we see a staff entwined with serpents. This is a clear reference to the caduceus, the staff of the Greek god of medicine, Asclepius. In the early 20th century, Germany was a scientific giant, winning 4 Nobel Prizes in medicine and 7 in chemistry by 1918. Finally, there are many fruits and vegetables depicted, as well as sheaves of grain, all of which represent Germany's agricultural abundance. In fact, Germany was the third largest economy in the world at this time. Probably the main thing that stands out about this note is its extreme intricacy. It is a beautifully illustrated image, but it is surrounded by an equally elaborate bordered frame as well as intricate background and both blue and green colors. Such complexity is both to impress and to protect. The more elaborate an image, the harder it is to copy, and counterfeiting was a problem in the past as much as it is today. Counterfeiters didn't have access to scanners and printers, but there were people who attempted to create their own plates and print money. Every issuer of banknotes had to be very careful to make their designs difficult to copy. And it wasn't just the design that was intended to protect against counterfeiters. The paper itself is also special. Most banknotes bear watermarks in their paper as a quick way to check that it is authentic. When we look at the paper with a strong backlight, we find this note has an elaborate watermark bearing the value 5 as well as geometric designs. Most counterfeit notes would not live up to the complex design or the paper quality and were thus detectable. So let's now examine the reverse. In addition to the blue and green colors of the obverse, the reverse also bears an overstrike purple seal of the Reichsschuldenverwaltung and a serial number in red. Serial numbers are yet another way to protect the note, making each one unique and official. The reverse of a note often emphasizes the circulating value and the laws protecting it. This note is no exception. Most prominent across the back is the value 5 marks, and the small and lengthy text in the upper left details the penalty for making or using false banknotes. In this case, the penalty is stated to be no less than 2 years in prison. Again, we have elaborate borders and beautiful design, but of course, we have to talk about the elephant, or in this case, the dragon, in the room. This amazing illustration is what makes the 1904 5 mark one of my favorite banknotes of all time. It's probably just the old Tolkien fan calling out from my past. But you have to admit that this is an impressive image of a dragon, and some 30 years before The Hobbit appeared in print. What better for circulating currency than a picture of an old-fashioned treasure, and what better to guard that treasure than an old-fashioned dragon? The dragon is wrapped around a cauldron full of treasures, and its head rests atop the 5 mark banner. Smoke twirls in tendrils from its nostrils, reaching up to meld with the right corner emblem, while its tail wraps back down and around the banner and knots below it. Though it is in a position of sleep, its eyes appear to be open, watching for anyone who would foolishly attempt to take the treasure from it. So once again, we have an image of protection. In this case, the specific protection of the expressed value of this very note. The warnings of prison for anyone who would cheat the system go hand in hand with the image of the watchful dragon, and its allegorical golden treasure speaks to the importance even of this lesser amount of 5 marks. Finally, the pairing of the purple seal of the Reichsschuldenverwaltung and its attendant's Reichsadler parallels the protective authority of that bureau with the dragon itself, showing that the German Empire stood behind its money. I love this note for its detail and for the insight into Imperial Germany it provides. It is a multifaceted attempt to instill pride, faith, and even fear. It's a fascinating note full of great imagery, but what does history show us Germany was really like in 1904? It was certainly a strong nation and wealthy at the time, but it had not been a unified empire for all that long. Germany had traditionally been a group of small states that often struggled against one another. It unified only under more struggles in 1871 when the various states were engaged in the Franco-Prussian War. This is probably why the imagery on the note harks so far back, to show that German history was regional, but they all shared many things, and all seemed to believe in monarchy as the states all had their own kings, even before empire. Now, a Prussian emperor might be the head of kings, but all the regions of this area, the old German states, were German and could identify as such. So this 1904 note depicts strength and abundance through kingship and shared cultural identity. But just 10 years later, the empire would be at war, teamed up with the Ottomans against the British and much of the world. I'm Dr. Brad Hafford. I hope you enjoyed looking at this banknote with me. Join me again next time on Note Nook, part of my series, Money Talks.